On the second dawn of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces press ever closer into the heart of the country, making their way surely but steadily towards Kyiv, the country's capital. Helicopters were seen flying low over Kyiv and near the Gostomel airbase. The US officials have said that Russian forces are already on the outskirts of Kyiv. 2 loud explosions were heard in Kyiv today morning. Ukraine's foreign minister tweeted that horrific Russian rocket strikes were being conducted on the capital and called on the world to once again stop Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian forces downed an enemy aircraft over Kyiv in the early hours of Friday, which then crashed into a residential building and set it on fire. It was unclear whether the aircraft was manned or whether it could be a missile. Kyiv municipal authorities said that at least 8 people were injured when the object crashed into an apartment block. In a midnight address, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that his country was left alone to fight Russia after the Kremlin launched a full-scale invasion. He also warned that Russian sabotage groups had entered the capital and urged residents to be vigilant and observe all curfew rules.
Але є й друге. Ми залишаємось наодинці у захисті нашої держави. Хто готовий воювати разом з нами? Чесно, не бачу таких. Хто готовий дати Україні гарантію вступу до НАТО? Чесно, всі бояться.
Now, for more updates on this escalating crisis, joining us now is our correspondent Giles Gibson from Moscow. Giles, thanks so much for joining us from Moscow at this hour. My first question to you, blasts are being reported in Kyiv, with the Ukrainian officials saying that the country's capital, Kyiv, has been hit by cruise of ballistic missiles. Russian forces are now about 20 miles from Kyiv, this according to top US officials. What does Russia have to say about all of this?
That's right. It's just over 24 hours now since Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, announced that he was launching this offensive into Ukraine. What we're hearing is that line from the US officials that's been reported that they believe that that Russian forces are roughly 20 miles away from Kyiv, the Russian capital. And we have to note that that was from the US Secretary of Defense, reported comments that he made to lawmakers several hours ago. So clearly the situation could have changed and those Russian forces could be even closer. As far as the Kremlin are concerned, though, they are not even commenting on these claims from the Ukrainian government that Russian forces have been killed, that Russian planes have been shot down over the country. Zero comment whatsoever coming out of the Russian Ministry of Defense or from the Kremlin about any casualties so far, as I say, just over 24 hours into this offensive.
Right. Now, Giles, is the President, Vladimir Putin, still standing by his claim to denazify Ukraine, as he said yesterday? And will these attacks continue in days to come? That's a big question.
Yeah, I just want to show you, actually. So UK newspapers, US newspapers, I'm sure the newspapers in India as well are full of comments from Western leaders condemning Vladimir Putin for this invasion. This is a newspaper here in Russia. It's in Russian, so I will translate. You've got a picture of Vladimir Putin there on the front, and the headline, it's a bit of a play on words, but it effectively says that Russia is containing potential aggression from Ukraine rather than the other way round. So that is the message that we're getting from sort of some newspapers and, of course, state-controlled television here in Russia about the aims of this offensive, what Vladimir Putin described as a special military operation, but what is clearly just a much broader, really, invasion of Ukraine as a whole.
Right. Giles, you're in Moscow in Russia. I want to get your take on what do the people of Russia think about their president's action. We've been talking about polls recently where a lot of people believe that the president's actions are justified. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, in a sense, is justified. What is the public sentiment in Russia as of now?
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin, when he made that address just over 24 hours ago, said very clearly that he believes he has the support of the Russian people for sending the country's troops into Ukraine. But we got clear evidence in the last 12 hours on Thursday night local time here in Russia, in Moscow, because you had protesters going out onto the streets to make their voices heard and to protest against this war. Here in Moscow, you had several thousand protesters gathering in Pushkin Square. That's a square right in the heart of Moscow that's a traditional home for protests and that sort of thing. Alongside them, you, of course, had a heavy police presence trying to quash those protests. You also had, according to independent monitors, protests breaking out in more than 50 cities right across Russia, including in St. Petersburg. And those independent monitors are also saying that more than 1,700 Russians were detained by authorities for protesting or trying to protest against this war. So that gives you a sense of the public mood here in Russia. Lots of protests breaking out and the authorities trying to put them down.
In fact, Giles, as you mentioned, there are protests in Russia. In fact, there are protests across the world in different cities, as we hear. How has the Russian government responded to these protests? We hear of crackdowns that are currently ongoing.
Yeah, there has been strong crackdowns on the protests here in Russia. There are massive police presence at that protest that I was just talking about at Pushkin Square, right in the heart of Moscow. But what we also saw from protesters is signs in English, so holding up signs saying no to war and things like that. So I think the protesters were clearly trying to make their voices heard within Russia, but they were also, it seems, trying to send a message out to the rest of the world that despite those claims from their president that this is somehow about the denazification of Ukraine, that they are somehow trying to contain Ukrainian aggression from NATO rather than the other way around. Clearly they are trying to send a message that not the entire Russian people, that the entire Russian people are far from united behind this decision to send troops in.
Right, Giles Gibson, thank you so much for all your inputs and thanks for joining us on WION at this hour with all those inputs. Let's now get you up to date with what's happened so far in the Ukraine conflict. We are, of course, since morning getting reports that Ukraine officials are clearly saying that an enemy aircraft was downed after blasts heard as the EU prepares for harshest sanctions against Russia. Remember, WION has been reporting on this conflict and we've been telling you about all the updates that are happening in Kyiv as we speak. The recent updates that we have at this hour is that loud explosions were heard in Kyiv, that is the Ukrainian capital, and this all is happening as the West, primarily led by the United States, is mulling new harsher sanctions. There's been a lot of global condemnation against Russia for its actions, for its blatant, unprovoked, unjustified attack on Ukraine. That's what the US said yesterday. Now, Ukraine officials today are saying that an enemy aircraft was downed after blasts were heard as the EU now is preparing the harshest sanctions, as the bloc calls it, against Russia. Some more updates coming in. Ukrainian forces downed an enemy aircraft over the capital Kyiv, which then crashed into a residential building and set it on fire. This is what Ukraine's Interior Ministry has said. The European Union, meanwhile, will freeze Russian assets in the bloc and halt its banks' access to European financial markets. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has now said that more than 130 civilians and military personnel have been killed so far in the ongoing bombing. Zelensky has also signed a decree on the general mobilization of the population. Remember, yesterday the Ukrainian president said that Ukraine has been left to fight on its own against Russia. He says that the sanctions that the West has imposed or is threatening to impose are nowhere near enough. All this is, of course, happening while the enemy knocks on the door. On the borders, Russian soldiers, according to reports, are advancing in the direction of the Ukrainian capital. A US official has said this, reportedly, that Moscow is continuing its invasion of Ukraine. Let's tell you what other global leaders have said as Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine. The United Nations Refugee Agency says that an estimated 100,000 Ukrainians have fled their homes. WION has been bringing you stories of students, foreign students, especially Indian students that are currently stuck in Ukraine. The Indian government at the moment is trying its best to evacuate them as soon and as safely as possible. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.